They told me the gate would open at 9 in the morning. Nobody told me that my own front door would open on my husband, half-dressed, standing behind the woman I had called my sister for 20 years. 3 years I spent inside a military prison for a crime I never committed. And in that time, my best friend didn't just take my house. She took my name, my money, and the man who promised to love me until death. What she never expected was that my first phone call, standing in that driveway, wouldn't be to a lawyer for revenge. It would be to the one man who could take away everything she thought was finally hers. The gate buzzed at 9:02 in the morning, and I remember thinking that even freedom in this country runs 2 minutes late. I stood there in the same clothes I had worn to my sentencing 3 years earlier. Clothes that didn't fit right anymore. Prison changes the shape of a woman, even when it can't touch what's inside her. The guard, a boy who couldn't have been older than 25, held the door for me like I was still someone who mattered. Maybe I was. Maybe I always had been, and it just took the United States federal government 3 years to admit it. "I'm sorry, Colonel," he said. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, something between guilt and relief that it wasn't his mess to clean up. I didn't answer him. 22 years in the Army teaches you that some silences say more than any apology ever could. I stepped out into sunlight I hadn't chosen in 3 years, and it felt heavier than I expected, pressing down on my shoulders like a hand reminding me I was still being watched, still being measured. There was no one at the gate. No husband. No flowers. No sign that anyone in the world had marked this day on a calendar and waited for it. Just a paper bag with my personal effects, my wedding ring buried somewhere inside it, and a manila envelope holding what remained of a life the Army had once told me I'd thrown away. I called a taxi because I didn't know who else to call yet. The driver was quiet, which I was grateful for. I watched the base disappear in the side mirror, and somewhere in my chest, underneath the numbness, something small and stubborn was still breathing. 3 years of nights on a thin mattress, reciting military justice statutes to myself like prayers, had taught me that grief and patience could live in the same body without one killing the other. We reached my street just before noon. Same oak tree in front of the neighbor's place. Same crooked mailbox 2 doors down that nobody had ever bothered to fix. And there, at the end of the block, my house. White shutters. Navy blue door. The one I had picked out with Daniel 11 years ago, back when we were young enough to believe that love was something you built once and then simply maintained. There was a child's bicycle on the lawn. Not ours. We never had children, not by choice so much as by the slow erosion of trying and failing, and eventually stopping the trying altogether. A little girl ran across the grass, laughing, chasing a dog I didn't recognize. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, feeling something in me go very still, the way soldiers learn to go still right before contact. The front door opened. Emily stood there in a silk robe I had never seen before, her hair still damp, a coffee mug in her hand that I recognized instantly, because I was the one who had bought it years ago, during a weekend trip the 3 of us had taken together. Back when the 3 of us still meant something good. She saw me, and the mug slipped an inch in her hand before she caught it. I watched her face do the arithmetic. Confusion. Then recognition. Then something closer to horror. The particular horror of someone realizing that a debt they had assumed would never come due had just walked up their driveway, wearing government-issued shoes. "Catherine," she said. My name sounded strange in her mouth, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. I didn't answer. Behind her on the stairs, I heard footsteps. Slower. Heavier. A man's footsteps I knew as well as my own heartbeat because I had fallen asleep to that particular rhythm for over a decade. Daniel came down in a t-shirt and boxers, running a hand through his hair. And when he saw me standing there, he froze. The way men freeze when a story they have been telling themselves for years suddenly collides with the truth. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. "I want to tell you," I screamed. I want to tell you I cried, or broke something, or said all the things I had rehearsed in my head during 1,000 sleepless nights in that prison. But that isn't what happened. What happened is that I looked at both of them, standing in the doorway of my own home, wearing the evidence of everything they had built on the assumption that I would never come back. And I smiled. Not because I had forgiven them. Not because it didn't hurt, because it did. It hurt in a place so deep I didn't have a name for it yet. I smiled because for the first time in 3 years, I finally had all the information I needed. I turned around, walked back to the taxi still idling at the curb, and got in. The driver asked where to. I didn't answer him either. I was already dialing. "Michael," I said when he picked up on the second ring. "It's Catherine. I'm ready." Then I looked back at the house one last time, at the navy blue door slowly closing, and I understood something with total clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes after you've lost everything and discovered you're still standing. This wasn't the end of my story. It was only the beginning of theirs. 3 years earlier, my life looked like something out of a magazine spread about the American dream. And I say that without irony, because that's exactly how naive I was. I was a lieutenant colonel with 22 years of service behind me, specializing in logistics and internal investigations, the kind of work that required patience, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to paperwork. Daniel was an architect with a growing practice, the kind of man who could talk about load-bearing walls with the same passion other men reserved for football scores. We had been married 11 years. We had a house we loved, a marriage we trusted, and a best friend we treated like family. Emily Carter had been in my life since college. 20 years of friendship, the kind that survives cross-country moves, deployments, and the slow accumulation of secrets that friends collect about each other over decades. She was smart, funnier than she gave herself credit for, and endlessly charming in rooms full of strangers. She could walk into any gathering and, within 10 minutes, have everyone convinced she'd known them for years. I loved her. That's the part people find hardest to understand later, when they hear how the story ends. I loved her the way you love a sister. Uncritically. Generously. Without keeping score. I helped her when her first marriage ended and she needed a place to stay for 4 months. I loaned her money when her business idea fell through, money I never asked her to pay back, because that's not what you do for family. I introduced her to clients, to contacts, to anyone I thought might open a door for her. I never once thought about what it might feel like to stand next to someone whose life seemed to unfold with a kind of effortless forward motion that yours never quite matched. I understand it now. I didn't understand it then. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March. The kind of ordinary day that gives no warning about the landslide it's about to trigger. Classified logistics documents went missing from a secure server I had access to as part of my role. Not the kind of thing that happens by accident, and not the kind of thing that gets explained away easily. An investigation opened within 72 hours, and I remember sitting across from 2 investigators, watching them lay out evidence with the calm efficiency of men who believed they already had their answer. Security footage placed me near the server room at the exact time of the breach. My email account showed correspondence I never sent. My personal accounts showed transfers I never made. Even fingerprint records supposedly matched an access panel I hadn't touched in months. It was too clean. That was the part that haunted me, even as they read the charges against me. Real mistakes are messy. Real crimes leave inconsistencies, contradictions, loose threads. This had none of that. This had the precision of something built, not something that happened. I sat in that courtroom and looked at the 2 people I trusted most in the world. Emily cried the hardest of anyone in that room. Real tears, the kind that seemed to come from somewhere true. And I remember thinking, even as the verdict was being read, that grief so convincing had to be genuine. Daniel cried too, though quieter, the kind of crying men do when they're trying to hold themselves together for someone else's sake. He held my hand under the table until the moment they led me away, And he told me, right before the doors closed, that he believed me, that he would wait, that we would fix this together. I believed him. I had no reason not to. The court-martial found me guilty of unauthorized disclosure of classified information and conduct unbecoming an officer. 22 years of service erased in an afternoon by evidence I couldn't explain and couldn't disprove fast enough to matter. They sentenced me to 5 years, though with good behavior I understood I might see 3. I remember the moment they took my sidearm, my identification, the insignia I had earned rank by rank over 2 decades of deployments and sacrifice. I remember thinking that the Army, the institution I had given my entire adult life to, was capable of being wrong in a way that felt almost impossible to survive. But I looked at Emily. I looked at Daniel. And something in me, some quiet, stubborn part that had survived deployments and losses and every hard thing life had thrown at me before, refused to let this be the final chapter. One day, I told them both, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking beneath the table, the truth will come. I didn't say it as a threat. I said it because it was the only thing I still had faith in, the only handhold left on a cliff face that had otherwise crumbled entirely beneath me. Emily nodded through her tears. Daniel squeezed my hand one last time before they separated us. I didn't know yet that the woman crying hardest in that courtroom had a reason to cry that had nothing to do with grief. I didn't know that the evidence against me hadn't assembled itself. I only knew, as they led me out of that courtroom in handcuffs, past reporters and colleagues, and the life I'd built for over 2 decades, that somewhere inside the wreckage of everything I'd lost, the truth was still out there, waiting for someone patient enough to go looking for it. I decided in that hallway, surrounded by military police and the echo of my own footsteps, that I would be that person. I had no idea yet how long it would take, or how much it would cost me, or how deeply the 2 people I trusted most had already begun rewriting my life without me in it. I only knew I wasn't finished. People assume prison breaks you. And for a long time I let them believe that story, because it was easier than explaining what actually happened inside those walls. The truth is, prison sharpened me. I was assigned to a minimum security military facility, the kind of place that housed officers whose crimes were administrative rather than violent. Paperwork criminals and men and women caught in the machinery of bureaucratic justice. It wasn't the nightmare civilians imagine when they hear the word prison, but it was still a cage, still a place designed to strip away identity one small indignity at a time. Same clothes as everyone else. Same schedule. Same narrow bed that never quite let you forget where you were, even in your dreams. For the first 2 weeks, I let myself grieve. I cried at night when no one could hear me, quietly, efficiently, the way you learn to do everything in the military. I replayed the trial over and over, searching for the moment I could have done something differently, said something differently, seen the trap before it closed around me. Then, on the 15th day, something shifted. I remember the exact moment. I was sitting in the small library the facility maintained, more out of legal obligation than genuine rehabilitation philosophy, and I found a copy of the Uniform Code of Military Justice sitting on a shelf, half forgotten, its spine barely cracked. I picked it up and I started reading. Not because I expected it to save me, but because I needed something to hold on to that wasn't grief. I read it cover to cover in 4 days. Then I read it again, slower, taking notes in the margins of a notebook I bought from the commissary. I studied hearing procedures. I studied rules of evidence, chain of custody requirements, digital forensics protocols. I studied every technical detail of how classified information gets logged, transferred, and tracked, because if someone had gone through the trouble of framing me with that kind of precision, I needed to understand exactly how deep that precision went. I started filing Freedom of Information Act requests within my first month. Small ones at first, testing the process, learning the language, understanding which offices responded quickly and which ones buried requests in bureaucratic silence. I requested server logs. I requested access records. I requested the original chain of custody documentation for every piece of evidence used against me. Most requests came back redacted, delayed, or denied outright. I didn't let that stop me. I filed appeals. I learned which oversight committees existed specifically to handle these disputes, and I wrote to them directly, week after week, building a paper trail of my own patience and persistence that I hoped someday someone would actually read. At night, I kept a journal. Not of feelings, but of facts. Every detail I could remember about the weeks leading up to the breach. Every conversation with Emily. Every strange comment from Daniel I'd dismissed at the time as nothing. I wrote down times, dates, small inconsistencies that hadn't seemed important in the moment, but that, laid end to end, started to form a pattern I couldn't quite name yet. I wasn't the only one who noticed something didn't add up. 18 months into my sentence, a Naval Criminal Investigative Service agent named Rachel Voss picked up a routine audit of digital evidence archives, the kind of dry administrative review nobody expects to matter. She found inconsistencies in timestamp metadata on the server logs used in my case. Small inconsistencies, the kind most people would overlook. But Rachel Voss was not most people. She requested my case file. She cross-referenced access logs with badge scan records from the building. She found gaps, moments where the digital trail contradicted the physical trail, small fractures in a story that had once seemed seamless. I didn't know any of this was happening in real time. I only learned about it 8 months later, when a young officer visited me and told me, with careful, measured words, that new evidence had come to light suggesting irregularities in the original investigation. I didn't cry when he told me. I'd used up my tears in those first 2 weeks, back when I still believed grief alone could carry me through this. Instead, I asked questions. Specific ones. What kind of irregularities? Whose access logs? What time frame? I asked like an investigator, not like a victim. Because somewhere in those 18 months of reading and writing and refusing to let go, I had stopped thinking of myself as someone this had happened to and started thinking of myself as someone actively working to unmake it. The investigation took another year to complete. A full year of waiting, of watching other inmates come and go, of maintaining a kind of discipline that felt, some days, like the only thing keeping me tethered to who I used to be. Then, 3 years almost to the day after I'd been sentenced, they told me the truth had finally surfaced. Someone had accessed my credentials remotely, using information they shouldn't have had. Someone had manipulated timestamp data to place me at the scene of a crime I hadn't committed. Someone with detailed knowledge of my passwords, my schedule, my personal life. Someone who knew me intimately enough to frame me perfectly. My conviction was vacated. My record was expunged. The federal government, in the careful, bloodless language of official correspondence, acknowledged that I had been wrongfully convicted based on fabricated evidence. I didn't celebrate when they told me. I didn't cry either. I simply sat with the news for a long moment, feeling something settle inside me, something that had been suspended for 3 years, finally finding solid ground again. Now, I said quietly, to no one in particular, to the empty room, to the version of myself who had sat in that courtroom 3 years earlier and promised the truth would come. My real work begins. Because clearing my name was never going to be enough. I needed to know who had done this to me. And some part of me, the part that had spent 3 years reading law books and filing patient appeals, already suspected I wasn't going to like the answer. Michael Sanders met me at a small diner 2 miles from the base, 3 days after my release. The same diner we used to study in back in college, when we were 22 years old and neither of us had any idea what our lives would eventually cost us. He looked older, grayer at the temples, but his eyes were the same. Sharp and steady, the eyes of a man who had built a reputation as one of the most formidable civil attorneys on the East Coast by never underestimating an opponent. I'm not here for revenge, I told him before he could even sit down fully. I'm here because I want everything back that was taken from me, and I want it done the right way. Documented. Legal. Undeniable. He nodded slowly, the way he used to nod over a difficult case study, and pulled out a legal pad. Then let's find out exactly what was taken. What we found over the following weeks went far beyond anything I had imagined sitting in that prison cell, turning over vague suspicions in the dark. Emily had power of attorney documents dated during my first year of incarceration, granting her authority over my financial accounts. My signature appeared on those documents. I had never signed them. Michael brought in a forensic document examiner, a quiet, meticulous woman named Grace Liu, who had spent 15 years testifying in fraud cases up and down the East Coast. Grace compared my known signature samples against the documents Emily had filed with the bank, and within a week she had identified 17 distinct inconsistencies in stroke pressure, letter formation, and pen lift patterns. My signature had been forged carefully by someone who had clearly practiced it many times before committing it to official paperwork. That was only the beginning. Emily had used that forged power of attorney to access my investment accounts I had built over 2 decades of careful saving and smart planning. She had liquidated a retirement fund worth just under $400,000, transferring the proceeds through a series of accounts before eventually funneling most of it into a joint account she shared with Daniel. She had also filed paperwork transferring the deed to our house into a trust she controlled, using documentation that claimed I had willingly relinquished my ownership stake during my incarceration. Except I had never relinquished anything. I had never even been informed such paperwork existed. Insurance policies I had maintained for over a decade had been quietly restructured. Beneficiaries changed. Payout terms modified in ways that benefited Emily directly in the event of my continued incarceration. Or, I realized with a chill that settled deep into my chest, my death. Tax filings during my 3 years away showed income and deductions that made no sense given my actual circumstances, filings that Emily had submitted using my identifying information without my knowledge or consent. Michael sat across from me one evening, surrounded by boxes of financial records we'd subpoenaed, and rubbed his eyes with the particular exhaustion of a man who had underestimated the scope of what he was dealing with. "Catherine," he said, "this case is becoming enormous. This isn't just betrayal. This is systematic financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, and likely money laundering. All built over 3 years, with a level of planning that honestly disturbs me." I sat quietly, absorbing each new revelation with a strange, cold calm that surprised even me. I'd expected anger. I'd expected grief. What I felt instead was something closer to clarity. The particular clarity that comes from finally understanding the true shape of a threat you'd once mistaken for a friend. I thought about all the years I had trusted Emily with details of my life. My passwords, shared casually during trips when we needed to check each other's accounts for shared expenses. My social security number, given to her once when she was helping me file paperwork during a deployment overseas. My signature, seen 1,000 times on birthday cards, on shared lease agreements, on documents she had watched me sign at kitchen tables over 20 years of friendship. She hadn't needed to break into my life to destroy it. I had handed her the keys myself, one trusting moment at a time, never imagining that the woman I called my sister was quietly cataloging every vulnerability I never thought to protect. "We don't confront her yet," I told Michael, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "We don't call. We don't warn her. We build the case completely. Every document. Every transaction. Every forged signature. Until there's nothing left for her to explain away." Michael studied me for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his face. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I spent 3 years learning that patience isn't weakness," I told him. "It's a weapon, if you're willing to wait long enough to use it properly." We spent the following 2 months building what would eventually become one of the most thorough financial fraud cases Michael had assembled in his career. We traced every dollar. We subpoenaed banking records from 4 separate institutions. We interviewed former colleagues of Emily's, who described a woman who had grown increasingly confident, increasingly comfortable over the past 3 years. Someone who spoke about her life with a kind of easy entitlement that never quite matched her actual income or background. We discovered she had told mutual friends that Daniel and I had been separated long before my conviction, a lie designed to make her relationship with him seem less like betrayal and more like inevitability. We discovered she had spent considerable effort managing the narrative around our friendship, quietly recasting herself as someone who had reluctantly stepped in during an impossible situation, rather than someone who had orchestrated that situation from the very beginning. Every piece we uncovered made the picture clearer and colder. This wasn't a woman who had made one desperate mistake in a moment of weakness. This was someone who had built an entire alternate life on the foundation of my absence, brick by careful brick, confident that the woman she was stealing from would never come back to reclaim what belonged to her. She was wrong. And by the time Michael and I finished compiling that first wave of evidence, I understood something with total certainty. Emily Carter had not simply betrayed me. She had committed crime after crime after crime, each one building on the last, each one requiring a level of calculation I hadn't believed her capable of, even after everything. And now, for the first time since that courtroom 3 years earlier, I finally had the power to make sure every single one of those crimes came fully into the light. Daniel believed the story was over. I know this because Michael's investigator, a retired detective named Frank Ostrowski, who had spent 30 years working white-collar crime before going private, told us as much after weeks of careful, distant observation. Daniel had resumed his architecture practice. He had taken on new clients, expanded his firm into a second office downtown, and by every outward measure built a life that looked settled, comfortable, and entirely confident that his past with me had been permanently closed. Emily, according to neighbors and former colleagues Frank quietly interviewed, had grown even more relaxed. She told people at dinner parties that I had simply disappeared into my own disgrace, that she and Daniel had found each other during an impossibly difficult chapter, and that time, as it always does, had smoothed over whatever complicated feelings might have once existed. She spoke about the house, my house, as though she had always belonged there. She wore confidence like a garment tailored specifically to her comfort, unremarkable and taken for granted. Neither of them had any idea that every transaction, every forged document, every quiet redirection of my money and my identity had already been cataloged, cross-referenced, and prepared for formal legal action. The first sign that their world was about to change arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Daniel received a certified letter at his office, a summons requiring him to appear for deposition in a civil matter involving fraudulent transfer of marital property and misappropriated financial assets. According to what Frank later learned, Daniel initially assumed it was some kind of clerical error, a lingering piece of paperwork from my old court-martial that had simply resurfaced. He called his own attorney. His attorney called the number listed on the summons. Michael answered. Within 48 hours, Daniel understood this was not an error. The following week, his primary business bank account was frozen, pending investigation into commingled funds, some of which had been traced directly back to the retirement account Emily had illegally liquidated using the forged power of attorney. Federal investigators, following up on financial anomalies Michael's team had flagged, opened a parallel inquiry into potential tax fraud, since income from the fraudulently obtained funds had never been properly declared. The house, the one I had stood in front of on the day of my release, was placed under a legal hold, preventing any sale or further transfer pending resolution of ownership claims. Daniel discovered for the first time that the deed transfer Emily had arranged years earlier had never actually been fully legitimate, meaning his own legal claim to the property he had been living in was considerably shakier than he had ever imagined. Clients began quietly withdrawing from ongoing projects. Word travels fast in small professional communities, and whispers about federal investigations tend to travel faster than almost anything else. 2 major contracts fell through within the same month. A third client, midway through construction on a commercial property, formally terminated their agreement, citing concerns about Daniel's financial stability and professional judgment. I imagine, though I wasn't there to witness it directly, that this was the moment Daniel finally sat Emily down and demanded answers. Frank's later report to Michael described a screaming match overheard by neighbors on 3 separate occasions that week, Daniel's voice raised in a way people said they had never heard before, demanding to know exactly what Emily had done, what she had dragged him into without his knowledge or consent. Emily's confession, when it finally came, was not the confident, composed performance she had maintained for 3 years. According to what later emerged in deposition, she admitted to forging the power of attorney documents. She admitted to the fraudulent deed transfer. She admitted to manipulating insurance beneficiary designations and filing false tax documents using my identifying information. She told Daniel she had done it because she loved him, because she had always loved him quietly, for years before my conviction, and that watching an opportunity emerge to finally have the life she felt she deserved had simply been too tempting to resist. Daniel, according to Frank's sources, sat in stunned silence for a long time after that confession. He had spent 3 years believing, or at least telling himself he believed, that my guilt had been established beyond reasonable doubt, that moving forward with Emily had been a natural consequence of circumstances entirely outside his control. He had built an entire emotional narrative that absolved him of any real responsibility for how quickly he had moved on, how easily he had accepted evidence against his own wife without demanding deeper scrutiny. Now he understood, in the space of a single devastating conversation, that he had not simply lost his wife to unfortunate circumstances. He had been maneuvered carefully and deliberately by someone he had trusted completely into abandoning a marriage that had never actually failed on its own merits. I felt something complicated when Michael relayed all of this to me, sitting in his office with late afternoon light slanting through the blinds. I want to say I felt satisfaction or vindication, the clean emotional payoff you're supposed to feel when people who have wronged you finally begin facing consequences. What I actually felt was something quieter and more complicated. A kind of grief, still, for the marriage I had once had. Even as I recognized that the version of Daniel who had made those choices, who had been quick enough to move on, easy enough to manipulate, credulous enough to build a new life on someone else's fabricated confidence, was not entirely a victim in this story either. He had questions he never asked. He had doubts he never pursued. He had, in his own way, chosen convenience over the harder, more uncomfortable work of standing firmly beside the woman he had promised to love, regardless of circumstance. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not yet. But I understood, watching his carefully constructed world begin to unravel thread by thread, that the story wasn't going to end with simple villains and simple victims. It was going to end with the truth finally fully exposed, and with every single person involved forced to reckon honestly with the choices they had made. The second courtroom I sat in during this story looked nothing like the first. The military court-martial 3 years earlier had been sterile, formal, heavy with the particular gravity of institutional power moving against a single individual. This courtroom, a federal civil proceeding held in a modern building downtown, felt different in ways I hadn't expected. Sunlight came through tall windows along one wall. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back neatly, moved through proceedings with brisk, unsentimental efficiency. This time, I wasn't the one sitting at the defendant's table. Emily was. She wore a gray suit that looked expensive but slightly too big for her, as though she had lost weight in the months since her confession to Daniel. Since federal investigators had expanded their inquiry to include not just civil fraud, but potential criminal charges as well. Her attorney, a tired-looking man who had clearly inherited a case with very little room to maneuver, sat beside her, occasionally leaning over to whisper something she barely seemed to register. The charges against her had grown substantially since that first conversation with Daniel. Forgery of financial documents, wire fraud, identity theft, fraudulent transfer of property, filing false tax returns, money laundering, since investigators had traced funds moving through no fewer than 6 different accounts in an attempt to obscure their original source. 17 separate counts, each one requiring careful documentation, each one supported by the meticulous evidence Michael's team and I had spent months assembling. I was called as a witness on the 3rd day of proceedings. Walking to that stand felt like walking toward something I had been preparing for since the moment I read my first page of military law in that prison library 3 years and a lifetime ago. I wore my dress uniform, insignia restored, rank reinstated, every visible marker of the life that had been stolen from me now fully returned. I answered questions clearly, factually, without embellishment. I described the friendship Emily and I had shared for over 20 years. I described the trust one had extended to her without hesitation, the passwords shared casually, the financial information exchanged during moments of convenience that I never imagined could later be weaponized against me. I described walking up to my own front door after 3 years in prison and finding another woman living my life. I did not cry on that stand. I had promised myself, somewhere during those long nights of writing in my journal, that if this moment ever arrived, I would meet it with the same discipline that had carried me through everything else. Emily's attorney, during cross-examination, attempted to paint a picture of 2 friends whose relationship had simply, tragically drifted apart under extraordinary circumstances, suggesting that perhaps some of the financial decisions Emily made could be understood as reasonable responses to genuine uncertainty about my situation and my future. I answered calmly. Emily didn't make one decision under uncertainty. She made dozens of decisions over 3 years, each one requiring active forgery, active deception, and active theft. There is nothing uncertain about signing someone else's name to a legal document. The courtroom was quiet after that. When Emily herself eventually took the stand during her own defense's case, I watched something in her finally break open completely. Gone was the composed, charming woman who had spent 2 decades making everyone around her feel like the most important person in the room. What remained looked exhausted, hollowed out by months of legal pressure and the slow, grinding realization that every carefully constructed justification she had built for herself was collapsing under the simple weight of documented fact. She looked directly at me during her testimony, something I hadn't expected. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, her voice cracking. "It started so small, just helping with paperwork while you were away. And then Daniel needed someone, and I was already there, and it just kept growing, and I told myself I deserved a chance at happiness, too." She paused, and when she spoke again her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I just wanted your life, Catherine. I wanted what you had. The marriage. The career. The way people respected you. I told myself if I could just have a piece of it, it wouldn't really hurt anyone." The courtroom held its breath, waiting, I think, for me to respond with anger or triumph or some cathartic outburst that would give this moment the emotional climax everyone in the room seemed to expect. Instead, I looked at her steadily, and I said the only thing that felt honest. "You could have built your own." For words. That was all. But I watched them land on her like something physical. Watched her flinch as though I had struck her, because we both knew it was true. She'd had every opportunity, every resource, every relationship I had ever offered her freely and generously, to build something of her own rather than dismantling what belonged to me. Daniel sat in the gallery that day, several rows back, and I felt his eyes on me throughout my testimony, though I never once looked directly at him. When the proceedings broke for recess, I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway, shoulders hunched, staring at the floor, unable to meet my gaze even from a distance. He understood, I think, sitting in that gallery, exactly what he had allowed to happen. Not just what Emily had done to me, but what his own willingness to believe convenient lies, his own reluctance to ask harder questions, had permitted to unfold over 3 years of his life. I felt no satisfaction watching him sit there in that quiet shame. I felt instead a strange and unexpected sense of closure. The particular peace that comes not from vengeance, but from finally standing in a room where the truth, after everything, was being heard clearly by everyone present. Emily was sentenced on a gray Thursday morning in late autumn. 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, and money laundering, with restitution ordered in an amount that would take her decades to repay, even if she found steady work the moment she was released. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing itself. Michael attended and called me afterward, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had spent months buried in someone else's crimes. He told me Emily had wept quietly as the judge read the sentence, and that Daniel had not been present at all. Daniel's situation resolved differently and more complicated than I expected. Because prosecutors couldn't establish that he had known about the forged documents or actively participated in the fraud, he avoided criminal charges. But the civil judgments were devastating in their own right. He lost the house entirely, since the court determined the original deed transfer had been fraudulent from the beginning, restoring full ownership to me. He lost the joint accounts, the retirement funds Emily had funneled into shared assets, and faced a wave of civil suits from clients and contractors seeking damages from the collapse of his practice's reputation. Within a year, his firm closed permanently. I heard secondhand that he moved to Ohio to work for his brother's construction company. I haven't spoken to him since that day in the courthouse hallway when he couldn't meet my eyes. I don't know if I ever will. For myself, the reckoning that followed felt less like triumph and more like a slow, careful rebuilding, the kind that happens one deliberate choice at a time. The Army restored my full military record, my rank, and my pension benefits, along with a formal acknowledgement of wrongful conviction that came with meaningful federal compensation for the 3 years I'd lost. The civil court awarded me the house outright, along with damages recovered from Emily's remaining assets, though I understood early on that no amount of money could fully replace what those 3 years had actually cost me. I didn't move back into that house. I stood on the front lawn one final afternoon, looking at the navy blue door, the white shutters, all of it exactly as I remembered. And I understood that the woman who had loved that house 11 years ago wasn't entirely the woman standing there now. Too much had happened inside those walls, both before my conviction and during my absence, for it to ever feel like sanctuary again. I sold it within 2 months. I used part of the proceeds, along with my restored pension and compensation, to buy a small house near the coast. Modest, quiet, with a porch that faced the water and let me watch the sunrise every morning without anyone else's history pressing in around me. Michael visited a few months after I'd settled in, and we sat on that porch one evening with coffee going cold in our hands, watching the tide roll in. "Do you regret anything?" he asked me. I thought about the question seriously, the way I had learned to think about everything during 3 years of forced patience. "Only one thing," I said. "What's that?" I looked out at the water, at the last light catching the waves in a way that felt, for the first time in years, entirely peaceful. I trusted the wrong people, I told him. But I never stopped trusting the truth. And in the end, That was the only thing that actually mattered. I think about that a lot now, in this quieter chapter of my life. About how easy it is to mistake charm for character, convenience for love, and silence for peace. About how the people who hurt us most deeply are rarely strangers. They're the ones who already have the keys because we handed them over freely, believing trust alone was enough to keep us safe. It wasn't malice that destroyed my life for those 3 years. It was my own generosity, extended without enough discernment, combined with someone else's willingness to exploit exactly that generosity for her own gain. And it was patience, documentation, and an unshakable commitment to the truth that eventually brought it all back. I walk on that beach most mornings now, coffee in hand, watching the sun come up over water that asks nothing of me and offers nothing but quiet, steady beauty in return. I've made peace with what I lost. I've made peace, mostly, with the people who took it from me. And I've built something new, something entirely my own, on the other side of everything that tried to break me.